France tried to crush him, the world tried to ignore him, but one call changed everything. This is not just a political story, it's a storm. It's betrayal, resilience, and power rediscovered in the hands of a young African captain. Welcome to Captain Ibrahim Traoré, where we uncover the stories they fear, the truths they bury, and the voices they try to silence. Before we begin, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to join the movement. Now, let's begin the story they never wanted you to hear. Burkina Faso had always been more than a former French colony. It was a strategic outpost, a silent pawn in the chess game of geopolitics. And for decades, Paris played its role well. It whispered through embassies, brokered silent deals, and pulled strings behind velvet curtains. But then everything changed when a young, defiant captain rose through the ranks of the military. His name, Ibrahim Traoré. By the time Traoré took power, the French influence had wrapped itself around every artery of the Burkina government like an old vine. Advisors from Paris walked the halls of the Ministry of Defense. French consultants sat quietly in high-level security briefings. Even state media carried a tone, oddly sympathetic to European partners, brushing over rising discontent among locals. It started subtly. Budget decisions that curiously favored French contractors, infrastructure projects delayed unless approved by French financiers. Then came the whispers, allegations that certain army generals were reporting not to Ouagadougou, but to foreign handlers in Paris. When Traoré assumed leadership, it was under the banner of sovereignty. He wore no grand medals, spoke with clarity, and held the look of a man who had seen the battlefield and knew betrayal. His rise had not been smooth. There were factions, former loyalists to France, and deeply embedded elite units trained in foreign doctrines. The first moves were measured. Traoré reshuffled his inner circle, placing young, loyal officers into positions of influence. He called for audits of French-backed projects. He spoke of independence, not just in economy or politics, but in mind. But the reaction was swift. French media outlets began publishing stories framing Traoré as inexperienced, volatile, a populist surrounded by radicals. Behind the scenes, pressure mounted. Aid was paused, training missions were re-evaluated. A few French operatives, masked as NGO coordinators, began visiting opposition leaders in private. One night, a coded transmission intercepted by Traoré's intelligence team revealed something chilling, a planned operation to discredit him internationally, a digital smear campaign, staged riots. Even a potential political replacement had been groomed, an older general, once seen as a French ally. The young captain knew he was surrounded. The walls weren't built of stone, but of surveillance, influence, and quiet sabotage. He stood in the eye of a storm crafted over decades by foreign architects. But Traoré wasn't afraid. He had read their tactics, learned their games, and more importantly, he had allies they didn't know about. The clock was ticking. France was tightening its grip. But as the noose drew closer, the world had yet to see what this young African leader would do. Because what France didn't know was that a single phone call, one still to come, would unravel everything they had built. And far to the northeast, in a Kremlin office lined with war maps and history books, a man named Vladimir Putin was already watching. In the weeks following the intercepted transmission, a quiet fire began to spread within the presidential compound in Ouagadougou, not a fire of fear, but of resolve. Ibrahim Traoré, though young by presidential standards, understood the terrain of power. He had fought in deserts, walked among villages torn by terror, and buried comrades who had believed in the future of an independent Burkina Faso. Now, he knew, the enemy wore a tailored suit and carried a diplomatic passport. Rather than react with brute force, Traoré turned inward. He convened a midnight meeting, not in a palace hall, but in a dimly lit military bunker beneath the city. Seated around him were 8 trusted officers, all under the age of 40, each one battle-hardened and fiercely loyal. "The French think they've surrounded us," Traore said, voice steady, "but they've made one mistake." One of the younger captains leaned forward. "Which mistake, sir? They forgot we've been watching too." Over the next days, a silent campaign began. Without press conferences, without televised speeches, Traore began a methodical dismantling of French influence. Contracts once handed to Parisian firms were suddenly frozen under the guise of budgetary reevaluation. Military bases began reporting technical malfunctions that led to the disconnection of certain communication lines tied to French advisors. But most critically, Traore launched what would later be called Operation Eclipse. Its objective was simple: identify and isolate every Burkina official receiving covert instructions or funding from foreign interests. The investigation was swift and surgical. Encrypted devices were seized. Offshore accounts were traced. Some ministers were dismissed quietly. Others were offered a choice: confess and serve the Republic or disappear from public life entirely. At the same time, Traore turned to the people. He began visiting rural provinces, not with armed convoys but with small entourages, speaking directly to farmers, youth leaders, village elders. "Burkina Faso is not a chessboard," he said in one fiery speech beneath a baobab tree. "We are not pawns, we are the players now." His message spread like wildfire. Independent African journalists began documenting his defiance. Young Africans in Senegal, Mali, Niger started sharing his speeches on TikTok, dubbing him the people's captain. Then came an unexpected moment. In a closed-door meeting with his National Security Council, Traore received confirmation of something that shifted the tide entirely. A faction of elite Burkina soldiers, trained by the French, had requested to be reassigned under his direct command. They had seen enough. They had chosen country over clientelism. The narrative was flipping. French diplomats in Ouagadougou began sending urgent dispatches back to Paris. "Traore is consolidating power," one message read. "Public sentiment turning against us. Suggest economic sanctions or international censure." But the captain was already 10 steps ahead. He had sent his emissaries, not to Europe but to other parts of Africa, to the Middle East, and quietly to Moscow. Burkina Faso didn't just need resistance, it needed options. Energy deals were discussed with Algeria. Agricultural technology was sourced from Turkey, and through encrypted channels, a line was opened with Kremlin operatives. Traore did not beg for help. He offered a proposition. "If France wants to treat us like a battlefield," he said, "let them see what happens when the other side shows up armed with more than words." By the time France realized how rapidly their grip was loosening, Traore's house was no longer divided. His government was streamlined, his military unified, and his people, once silent, were now loud in their pride. But even with all his internal victories, Traore knew the next attack wouldn't come with warning. France was a master of cloak-and-dagger politics. And so, on a quiet evening beneath the flickering lights of Ouagadougou, as a desert wind passed through the palms, Traore picked up a secured phone. He dialed a number given to him weeks earlier by a discreet Russian intermediary. One ring, two, then a voice answered, deep, calm, unmistakable. "Captain Traore," it said, "we've been expecting your call." It began like any other humid evening in Ouagadougou. Street vendors were closing stalls. Children played barefoot under flickering street lamps, but beneath the quiet rhythm of daily life, something sinister stirred. At exactly 02:17 a.m., the first breach occurred. A military checkpoint near the presidential compound reported the approach of unmarked vehicles, black Toyota pickups, headlights off. Within minutes, communications went dark. Simultaneously, power was cut in 3 key districts. Traore's inner security team had drilled for moments like this. Code name: Midnight Silence. Within seconds, silent alarms were triggered in the presidential bunker. Traore, already half-dressed in his combat fatigues, emerged with the calm of a man who had long known this day would come. The coup had begun. At least 4 units, comprised of foreign mercenaries and Burkina operatives trained abroad, were converging on the palace. Their orders were simple: seize the captain, take control of the state broadcasting station, and install the pre-selected general who had been flown in days earlier under the guise of a medical consultation. But they had underestimated the man they were after. Even before the first round was fired, Traore's loyalists had already mobilized. A hidden tunnel system beneath the compound ensured the president could not be taken by brute force. Night vision units were deployed on rooftops. Armored vehicles, disguised as construction equipment, rolled out of underground storage. At the heart of it all was Traore, issuing commands calm and precise. "We don't shoot to kill unless we have to," he reminded his men. "These are our brothers misled, but not our enemies." By 3:00 a.m., fierce gunfire echoed through the capital. In the city's north, a broadcasting station was taken over by coup forces. A pre-recorded message aired: "Captain Traore has fled the country. The Transitional Military Council will restore order." It was a lie, and it didn't last long. Traore, using a portable satellite feed, broadcast a live message from the field. Helmet on, standing beside soldiers, dust on his boots. "I am here, I have not fled, and I will never abandon my people. Those who have sold their soul to foreign interests come forward. You are surrounded." The message ignited the public. Thousands poured into the streets clanging pots, waving flags, standing unarmed in front of military bases rumored to harbor coup plotters. In some neighborhoods, civilians linked arms to block roads. "We are the shield," they cried. The tide turned by dawn. 2 of the 4 coup factions surrendered outright. The third was ambushed in an alley by Traore's special guard. The fourth, the most dangerous, retreated to an airstrip, hoping for an extraction that never came. Unbeknownst to them, the Burkina Air Force, small but fiercely loyal, had intercepted French-coded transmissions. The extraction team had been grounded. By 10:00 a.m., the coup had failed. Traore stood at the gates of the presidential palace, surrounded by civilians and soldiers. He held up a document, proof of external funding, timelines, names. "We have the evidence, and we will show the world." News spread like wildfire. African news networks broke from routine to air footage of captured mercenaries, some carrying French ID tags. Leaked video showed one French-speaking officer confessing his mission under duress. France denied everything. "We categorically refute any involvement in the events of last night," said a spokeswoman. But it was too late. Traore had not only survived, he had won. And as the dust settled, one question echoed louder than all others: what would he do next? The sun had barely risen when Traore entered the secure communications chamber deep beneath the presidential palace. The failed coup had exposed the depth of foreign interference, but it had also exposed a truth the world could no longer ignore. Burkina Faso was not alone. A file labeled Scythe was placed before him, evidence gathered over months. Dossiers of operatives, funds funneled through dummy NGOs, encrypted chats in French intelligence codes. But more than evidence, it was leverage. The captain looked at his chief advisor. "It's time," he said. Using a scrambled satellite uplink, Traore dialed a secure Moscow number passed discreetly to him weeks earlier. On the 5th ring, a deep Russian voice answered, "Yes." "This is Traore." There was a pause. "We've been expecting your call." That same night, high above the clouds, a Russian Ilyushin Il-76 cargo plane altered its course. The Kremlin had anticipated this moment. Inside were not soldiers, but tactical analysts, radio jamming equipment, and encrypted comms systems. Burkina Faso needed help, not to surrender sovereignty, but to protect it. Within 48 hours, electronic warfare systems were silently deployed around Ouagadougou. Drone signals were scrambled. Foreign spy satellites experienced sudden blackouts. And across the city, black sedans with diplomatic plates delivered plain-clothed men speaking fluent French, but with unmistakable Russian mannerisms. Putin had not sent an army, he had sent a message. A new line of defense had formed, one the French could not trace, one that would not blink under pressure. On a secure call with the Kremlin, Putin's voice echoed through the line. "Captain, your fight is not just Burkina Faso's, it is the front line of a new Africa. Do not yield." The weight of those words did not escape Traore. That night, for the first time since the coup attempt, he stood alone on the rooftop of the presidential palace, wind brushing against his uniform. He looked at the stars and thought of Sankara, of Lumumba, of all who had dared to dream of a free Africa. He whispered to the wind, "Now they will see." And in the distance, the lights of the city flickered, alive, defiant, unbroken. The following morning, Ouagadougou awoke not to fear, but to preparation. While foreign powers scrambled to interpret the signals, Traore and his newly empowered security apparatus launched a decisive, preemptive counterstrike. No bullets, no bombs. This war would be won with exposure, precision, and silence. Codenamed Iron Echo, the mission was orchestrated across multiple fronts. First, a full sweep of the military command chain. Officers with questionable loyalties were summoned for sudden reevaluations. Those who couldn't answer for their actions were quietly removed, replaced by younger, disciplined nationalists trained in new Russian protocols. Second, the digital front. Russian cyber specialists, working alongside Burkina engineers, launched a stealth campaign to intercept and decode communications between known French liaisons and operatives still hiding in diplomatic posts. What they uncovered was staggering: encrypted files, flight manifests, and pay records for mercenaries who had fled the country during the coup. With the press watching, Traore convened a live broadcast. In a room filled with reporters from across Africa, he stood behind a podium flanked by two unarmed citizens, both survivors of the previous night's failed insurrection. "This is not just about one coup," he said. "It is about a century of hands pulling strings from across the sea. Today, we cut those strings." He revealed hard evidence: payment orders signed in Paris, flight plans of foreign jets landing without clearance, maps marked with infiltration routes. The world gasped. By noon, embassies in Ouagadougou were silent. Western ambassadors avoided cameras. The African Union called an emergency meeting. That night, Traore's forces raided a safe house on the outskirts of the capital. Inside, they found crates of surveillance equipment, unregistered firearms, and two French-speaking agents who had shredded half their documents but couldn't destroy everything. The tide was turning fast. On social media, the hashtag #AfricaForAfricans trended for the first time globally. Protesters in Mali, Niger, and Chad carried portraits of Traore next to Sankara and Nkrumah. In Nairobi and Addis Ababa, university students gathered for solidarity rallies. But the most critical move was yet to come. With the help of Russian defense consultants, Traore greenlit the reorganization of Burkina Faso's armed forces. The national army, once dependent on French doctrine, was reshaped into a mobile, autonomous force. Border surveillance drones were launched. A new communications satellite was leased from a Eurasian alliance. And at the center of it all, a Black Ops cyber unit, hidden beneath the Ministry of Information, began producing daily reports on foreign interference. Within 2 weeks, all French military presence was gone, not forced, exposed. Their mission had collapsed under the weight of its own secrets. And in the quiet corridors of the Élysée Palace, someone finally asked the unspoken question. How did we lose Burkina Faso? The answer was simple. They never truly understood Traoré, and now the world would have to. The diplomatic silence didn't last. Within days of Traoré's public revelations, the international press could no longer ignore the story. What began as quiet murmurs in African newsrooms exploded into a media firestorm across Europe. Le Monde published a damning exposé. Burkina Faso documents reveal covert ops linked to Paris. The Guardian followed. Traoré's coup survival unmasks old colonial ghosts. Even Germany's Der Spiegel asked the question France dreaded most. Has France-Afrique finally fallen? At the Élysée Palace, President Macron convened an emergency session with his foreign ministry. Files once hidden in classified archives were now flooding into journalists' inboxes, leaked by anonymous insiders, some of whom could no longer stomach the duplicity. France's official stance was denial. We reject any accusation of interference, the spokesperson repeated in press conferences. But the damage was done. African ambassadors in Paris were suddenly hard to reach. A planned summit in Dakar with French officials was postponed indefinitely. Public opinion in Ivory Coast, Senegal, and even Cameroon turned icy. The African Union, usually cautious in criticizing Western partners, issued a rare statement. The sovereignty of African states is non-negotiable. Any foreign attempts to destabilize member nations will be condemned and investigated. Inside Burkina Faso, the streets swelled with pride. Traoré's image adorned murals across Ouagadougou. Local musicians released protest songs, celebrating the man who stood when giants fell. But Traoré was not celebrating. In a closed-door meeting with his cabinet, he said, "They will retreat, yes, but they will not forget. France will shift its strategy, not abandon it. Our victory is fragile. We must be smarter than before." He ordered the formation of a new intelligence division, trained not just in counterespionage, but in psychological warfare and international law. Meanwhile, a quiet diplomatic offensive began. Burkina diplomats traveled to non-aligned nations, Brazil, India, Indonesia, presenting evidence, building support. In the UN General Assembly, Burkina Faso's ambassador gave a historic speech. "We are not your laboratory. We are not a leftover province. We are a sovereign people, watching, remembering, resisting." The chamber erupted in applause. In retaliation, France pulled several aid programs. It froze bilateral trade deals. French banks quietly flagged transactions from Burkina firms. But something had shifted. The old levers no longer worked. China offered to backfill infrastructure loans. Russia extended energy support. Turkey pledged agricultural partnerships. Burkina Faso no longer stood alone. And as Macron faced a scandal at home, Traoré stood on African soil, unshaken, unbent, and for the first time truly understood by his people. It was not just a diplomatic rupture. It was a reckoning. While the West scrambled to reassess its influence, Moscow moved with quiet precision. 3 weeks after the failed coup, a discreet Russian delegation arrived in Ouagadougou. There were no press conferences, no waving of flags, just one black convoy flanked by Burkina military escorts heading to the presidential compound. Behind closed doors, history was being written. The agreement was simple, yet transformative. 1. Mutual security pact. Russian military advisors would aid in reforming Burkina Faso's defense structure, from strategy to logistics. 2. Technology transfer. Burkina Faso would gain access to encrypted communication systems, cyber defense infrastructure, and advanced satellite imagery. 3. Energy partnership, a plan to build nuclear microreactors and solar infrastructure with Russian tech. 4. Cultural and educational exchange, scholarships for Burkina youth to study in Moscow, Russian language schools to open in Ouagadougou. But more than policy, it was a statement. Africa was choosing its partners on its own terms. The first public appearance was subdued yet symbolic. Traore stood beside the Russian envoy in front of the National Military Academy. "This is not dependency," Traore declared. "This is alignment, not of submission, but of sovereignty." Immediately, projects began. A Pan-African officer training school was established near Koudougou, with Russian instructors and Burkina leadership. A cyber command center, codenamed Dakar's Eye, was constructed to monitor regional threats. Joint military drills were launched under the banner Operation Nyanza, referencing the lake that borders multiple African nations, a symbol of continental unity. The effects rippled across the continent. In Mali, similar delegations followed. Niger and the Central African Republic sent envoys. The Sahel was no longer a fragmented buffer, it was becoming a bloc. Western media painted it as Russia's new empire, but African voices countered. "Is it empire?" a Kenyan journalist asked, "if the invitation was ours?" Traore's approval rating soared domestically. He was no longer just a leader, he was a symbol. Murals of him in Soviet-style heroic poses emerged across West Africa. Children in rural schools chanted songs of sovereignty, holding hand-drawn flags with the words, "Free by fire, free by blood, free by will." But Traore remained vigilant. In a private journal entry leaked months later, he wrote, "This alliance is not a marriage, it is a message. Let no partner, East or West, believe we will kneel again." The world was no longer watching Burkina Faso with pity or disregard. It was watching with caution. And for the first time in decades, Africa wasn't reacting. It was leading. 6 months after the failed coup, Ibrahim Traoré stood before the African Continental Assembly in Addis Ababa. The room fell into silence as he stepped to the podium. No teleprompter, no cue cards, just the unmistakable presence of a man who had stared down the old world and refused to blink. His voice was calm, but every word carried the weight of a continent. "I come not to declare war," he began, "but to declare awareness." He spoke of history, not as memory, but as a system still breathing. Of economic pipelines that flowed outward, never inward. Of elections monitored but never respected. Of security forces trained to serve foreign budgets, not local dignity. Then he paused. "To Europe," he said, "we are not angry, we are awake, and that may scare you more." The chamber erupted. Traoré's speech went viral across Africa. Memes, songs, murals, editorials. His words became rallying cries for a generation that had never seen an African leader speak truth without permission. But Traoré didn't stop there. He began convening regional meetings, not in Western hotels, but under trees in desert tents among people. In one gathering, attended by over 300 local leaders from Sahel communities, he said, "The day will come when we won't ask Europe to let us in. We'll ask ourselves whether we should let them back." These weren't empty words. Under Traoré's initiative, Burkina Faso suspended all mining concessions from European companies for review. A Pan-African digital currency pilot launched between 4 nations. A Truth Commission was formed to document post-colonial manipulation across West Africa. Meanwhile, European intelligence agencies began circulating internal memos. Burkina Faso is igniting anti-Western sentiment through cultural diplomacy. Traoré's model is spreading faster than anticipated. And they were right. Student protests broke out in universities across Europe, not just African diasporas, but European youth demanding that their governments unclench the continent. In Brussels, one French MP whispered to a colleague during a foreign affairs hearing, "If Traore keeps this up, he won't just change Africa, he'll change us." Back in Ouagadougou, Traore walked through the streets unguarded. Children ran to him, elders blessed him, traders offered water and whispered, "Don't let them silence you." He didn't smile often, but that day he did, because the battle was no longer just about Burkina Faso. It was about memory and dignity and voice. And now the voice of Africa was no longer an echo, it was thunder. The sun was setting over Ouagadougou, casting long golden shadows across the city's red earth. From the roof of the modest presidential residence, not the old colonial palace, Captain Ibrahim Traoré watched the horizon in silence. He was not a king, not a dictator, not a perfect man. But he had become something rarer, a leader who listened and then led. The people had chosen him, not in ballots manipulated by foreign consultants, but in the moments between chaos and clarity, in the face of bullets, betrayal, and broadcast lies. And he had stayed. Now, with the world's eyes upon him, he chose to speak one final time, not as a warrior or a politician, but as a son of Africa. In a pre-recorded message aired across the continent, Traoré stood before a simple wooden backdrop, draped in the national flag. "My brothers, my sisters," he began, "we have walked a long road, a road paved with chains, blood, and silence, but we have not walked it alone." He spoke of the past, not with bitterness but clarity, of the present, not with pride but responsibility, and of the future, not with promises but a call. "We are not against the world, we are simply choosing our own way through it." He thanked the youth who stood in front of tanks with only their voices. He honored the elders who whispered forgotten truths into waiting ears. He saluted the soldiers who protected not power but people. And then his tone sharpened. "If you are watching this from abroad, know this: Africa is not your experiment. We are not waiting for validation. We are no longer your stepping stone to power. We are your equals, and we will rise whether you accept it or not." The screen faded to black, but across millions of screens in Africa, one line appeared in white letters: "This is just the beginning." He stood when others knelt, he spoke when others were silent, and he rose not for power but for people. Captain Ibrahim Traoré didn't just survive the storm, he became it, and this was only the beginning. If this story stirred something in you, don't scroll away, hit like, share the truth, and subscribe to Captain Ibrahim Traoré, because when Africa speaks, the world must listen.